Today we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. The first in particular follows a young boy desperately fighting to save both himself and his father from certain death deep within the cave. The second tells the harrowing tale of a caver trapped in a twisted S-shaped passage in the most gruesome way, facing the angel of death. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On the morning of June 25th, 2004, Dan Garrison, age 38, and his 11-year-old son, Justin, prepared for what they thought would be a simple cave exploration. Their destination was Pepper Sauce Cave in Arizona, a limestone labyrinth known for its winding passages and challenging navigation. The outside temperature stood at a scorching 98 degrees Fahrenheit, 36.7 degrees Celsius, making the cool cave seem like the winter season. Dan had promised this adventure to Justin for his recent birthday, planning it as a special father-son experience they would remember fondly. Dan packed a small backpack with minimal supplies, 2 flashlights, a few snacks, and some water bottles. In his rush of excitement, he made 2 critical mistakes that would soon put their lives at risk. First, he failed to bring spare batteries for their flashlights. Second, he told no one, not even his wife, where they were going. These simple oversights would transform their adventure into a fight for survival. Dan was usually more careful, but his eagerness to show Justin the cave and his previous visit there years ago had made him overconfident. The pair arrived at Pepper Sauce Cave around noon. The entrance, a dark opening in the rocky hillside, swallowed them as they stepped inside. The temperature immediately dropped around them, and they switched on their flashlights to navigate the growing darkness. Justin gasped at the sudden change from bright desert sun to the cool shadows of the cave, his eyes taking time to adjust to the limited visibility. The passages twisted and turned, sometimes opening into larger chambers, other times narrowing so much they had to crawl on hands and knees. The rough stones scraped their clothes and skin as they pushed forward, excited by each new discovery. Justin pointed out strange rock formations, while Dan explained how water had shaped the cave over thousands of years. They took turns leading the way, their footsteps echoing off the walls around them. After about 2 hours of exploration, they reached an area known as the Book Room, a chamber named for the visitor logbook kept there. They signed their names, noting the time and date of their visit. At this point, they had traveled through numerous passages, made countless turns, and descended to a lower level of the cave using a rope they had found fixed in place by previous explorers. The book room was larger than most areas they had seen, with enough space to stand up straight and move around freely. As their excitement began to fade and hunger set in, Dan decided it was time to head back to the entrance. They turned around, expecting to retrace their steps, but soon realized a troubling fact. The passages all looked the same. The route that had seemed so clear on the way in now appeared to be part of a confusing maze. The familiar landmarks looked strange and unfamiliar. What Dan thought was the main passage they had used earlier split into 3 separate tunnels, none of which seemed right. After an hour of wrong turns and backtracking, Dan's watch showed it was 4 p.m. The cave's constant 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 degrees Celsius temperature, which had felt refreshing at first, now began to chill them as their bodies tired and their movement slowed. Justin looked to his father with growing concern in his eyes. They were lost, and no one knew where to find them. Their snacks provided some energy but did little to warm them in the persistent cold of the underground environment. The reality of their situation grew more frightening with each passing hour. Every passage led to another that looked just like it. Every chamber branched into multiple tunnels. Without a map or proper caving experience, they had no way to know which direction would lead them out. Dan checked his flashlight and noticed the beam was already growing dimmer. Without spare batteries, darkness would eventually become their biggest enemy. The thought of being trapped in total blackness made Dan's heart race, though he tried to stay calm for Justin's sake. As 7 p.m. approached, Dan made a critical decision. Rather than continuing to wander aimlessly, they needed a system. Inside the book room, they found a notebook and pen left by previous cavers. Using the compass on Dan's wristwatch, they began to sketch the passages as they explored them, marking dead ends and noting distinctive features. Dan explained to Justin how the compass worked and showed him how to record their path with simple drawings and notes. Their makeshift mapping system gave them purpose, but it was slow work. By 10 p.m., their flashlights were noticeably dimmer, the snacks they had brought were gone, and their water supply was running low. The cave's silence pressed in on them, broken only by the occasional drip of water and their footsteps on the stone floor. The mapping had revealed several loops in the cave system, where passages connected in unexpected ways, making navigation even more confusing. Justin struggled to stay awake as midnight approached. Dan found a relatively flat area with sandy ground and told his son to rest while he continued mapping nearby passages. The 11-year-old curled up on the hard ground, using his thin jacket as a pillow. The constant temperature felt increasingly cold as their body heat drained into the cave floor. Dan checked on Justin frequently, worried about his son's comfort and well-being in the harsh cave environment. Throughout the night, Dan took short breaks to check on Justin and rest his own tired body. Sleep came in brief, uncomfortable stretches. The complete darkness when they turned off their failing flashlights to save power was unlike anything they had experienced before. A blackness so absolute it seemed solid. Dan calculated they had been in the cave for over 12 hours, and the thought of their families not knowing their whereabouts weighed heavily on him. Morning arrived in the world above, but in the depths of Pepper Sauce Cave, time had lost all meaning. Dan's watch showed 7 a.m. They had now been in the cave for 19 hours. Their situation was growing more desperate. Their flashlights would not last much longer. Thirst had become their constant companion. Dan rationed their last half bottle of water, giving most of it to Justin, while taking just enough to wet his own parched lips. Justin, despite his fear, remained remarkably calm for an 11-year-old. When he woke, he told his father that they needed water. Dan agreed, but had no idea where to find it. Justin suggested they listen for dripping sounds that might lead them to water. Dan was impressed by his son's clear thinking under pressure, a sign of maturity beyond his years in this dangerous situation. With new purpose, they began moving slowly through the passages, turning off their flashlights periodically to listen. Justin's sharp ears caught the sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. They followed the sound, moving carefully in the direction it seemed to come from. The dripping grew louder as they navigated through narrow passages they hadn't explored before. As they rounded a corner, Justin's flashlight beam caught something unexpected, a rope hanging down from above. He froze, then called excitedly to his father. This was the same rope they had used the previous day to descend to the lower level of the cave. Dan recognized it immediately. The rope's frayed edges and knots were familiar marks they had noticed during their descent, confirming this was their path back. With renewed energy, Justin ran to get his father, who was exploring a nearby passage. Together, they climbed the rope to the upper level of the cave. From there, Dan recognized a formation they had passed on their way in. Following his memory and their crude map, they made steady progress toward the entrance. The map they had created through the night proved valuable, helping them avoid wrong turns they might have taken again. After nearly 24 hours in the depths of Pepper Sauce Cave, Dan and Justin saw a faint glow of natural light ahead. The cave entrance appeared, framing a patch of blue sky. They emerged into the blazing Arizona sunlight, squinting as their eyes adjusted to the brightness. The outside temperature had risen, but after the long, cold night underground, the heat felt wonderful on their tired bodies. The fresh air filled their lungs, replacing the damp, stale cave atmosphere they had breathed for a full day. Dan's car sat where they had left it, untouched. No search party had been organized because no one knew they were missing. Dan's wife had assumed they were visiting friends and would return later. If they had not found their way out, it might have been days before anyone realized they were gone. When they arrived home, Dan's wife was shocked to learn of their ordeal. The family agreed that future adventures would involve better planning and communication. This next story descends into pure nightmare. A lone caver wedged in a S-shaped tunnel, his body contorted, breath fading, as he stares into the quiet eyes of death itself. October 7th, 2022, began as an ordinary day in the Black Hills of South Dakota. 3 cave explorers prepared their equipment at the unmarked entrance of Mystic Cave, a relatively unknown system situated on private property. Mark Jennings, a veteran, standing 6'2" with a lean frame built from years of climbing and squeezing through tight spaces, checked his helmet light, batteries, and survey tools. His companions, both experienced themselves, packed small bags with water, energy bars, and additional survey equipment. Today's mission focused on exploring and mapping a newly discovered lead at the deepest section of the cave. The 3 entered Mystic Cave at 9:15 a.m. The entrance section offered comfortable walking space with ceilings high enough to stand upright, But this luxury gradually disappeared as they ventured deeper. Soon they were navigating a series of progressively smaller crawlways, their bodies pressed against the floor. 40 minutes into their journey, the team reached what had previously been considered the end of the explorable cave, a modest chamber where the ceiling hung just low enough to force a perpetual stoop. In the farthest corner, barely visible unless specifically searching for it, a small opening marked the site of recent excavation work. Several preceding trips had focused on widening this promising lead, creating a hole just large enough for a person to squeeze through. Beyond this point lay unmapped territory. Mark volunteered to investigate first. Despite his height presenting obvious challenges for tight cave passages, he had developed techniques over the years to navigate restrictions that seemed physically impossible. He approached the opening with measured confidence, studying the dimensions with his headlamp before removing his helmet and placing it on the ground beside him. The passage ahead appeared incredibly tight, perhaps 9 or 10 inches in height, with an immediate right-hand turn visible just a few feet in. Lying flat on his stomach, Mark pushed his helmet ahead into the passage and began the methodical process of compression. First his arms extended forward, then his head entered the space, followed by the careful working of his shoulders through the opening. The cold rock pressed against him from above and below, immediately sapping body heat through direct contact. The passage allowed no room for raising his head. He could only look forward by craning his neck slightly, creating immediate discomfort. 6 feet into the passage, Mark encountered the first significant obstacle, a sharp 90-degree bend to the right. The turn required complex body manipulation to navigate. He extended his right arm fully around the corner, while twisting his torso to align his shoulders with the bend. Each movement resulted in clothing dragging against rock, creating resistance that had to be overcome with pure muscular effort. His breathing became more measured, controlled to manage both the physical exertion and the psychological weight of the stone pressing from all sides. After maneuvering through the first bend, Mark could see the passage take another sharp turn, this time to the left, creating the S-shaped configuration that would prove so problematic. With determination, he continued forward, contorting his body to match the cave's demands. The second bend presented even greater difficulty. Mark removed his boots, pushing them ahead to gain the precious extra inches needed to make the turn. The rock scraped against his sock-covered feet as he inched forward. Beyond the S-bend, the passage unexpectedly angled steeply upward into a small chamber just large enough to sit in. This discovery brought momentary relief. He had found new passage, potentially significant for their mapping project. Mark took a moment to catch his breath in this relative spaciousness before considering his exit. He would need to descend the slope head first and navigate back through the S-bend in reverse. The trouble began when Mark positioned himself for the return journey. Descending the slope head first, he reached the first bend and immediately sensed something was wrong. The angle of approach from this direction was significantly more awkward. Where his body had naturally folded around the corners on the way in, it now resisted the unnatural contortions required for exit. His legs in particular could not make the sharp turns his upper body had managed earlier. The first real flash of concern came 15 minutes into his exit attempt. Despite repeated efforts with different body positions, Mark could not work his lower body through the second bend of the S-turn. Each failed attempt consumed energy and increased his heart rate, causing faster breathing in the confined space. The passage seemed to have grown smaller, though rationally, he knew this was impossible. The psychological effect of confinement began its insidious work on his mind. Mark's companions, waiting at the small chamber beyond the dig, grew concerned at the lack of progress. They could barely reach his outstretched hands. Together, they attempted to pull him forward while he pushed with his legs, but the angles worked against them. After an hour of fruitless efforts, the reality of the situation became clear. Mark was thoroughly stuck, unable to move more than 2 feet in either direction. His position was particularly troubling, flat on his stomach, arms extended forward, legs stretched behind, with his torso twisted to accommodate the first bend of the S-turn. The complete immobility triggered waves of primal fear that required constant mental management to suppress. The temperature of the cave, initially refreshing after physical exertion, now posed a serious threat. With Mark's body in direct contact with the limestone floor and ceiling, and no ability to move to generate heat, hypothermia became a real concern. 2 hours into the entrapment, Mark's companions made the difficult decision to seek help. One would remain with Mark, while the other would navigate the 40-minute journey back to the surface and call for rescue. The prospect of extended time in this position sent a wave of dread through Mark's body that was worse than the physical discomfort. Time stretched in the darkness. Minutes expanded to feel like hours. Mark focused on controlling his breathing, slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations to conserve energy and manage the growing anxiety. 4 hours into the ordeal, the first signs of rescue arrived in the form of local caving experts from the Pahasapa Grotto, several with specialized training in cave rescue. They brought essential supplies, communications wire to establish contact with the surface, food, water, heat packs, and most importantly, tools to modify the passage. The rescue presented immediate challenges. Even the smallest rescuer could barely reach Mark's head and one hand. The technical aspects of the rescue proved equally challenging. The hammer drill, their primary tool for passage modification, could only be operated from awkward positions, limiting its effectiveness. Each attempt at rock removal yielded small victories measured in fractions of inches. After each modification, rescuers would attempt extraction by rigging webbing around Mark's wrists and pulling while he pushed with his legs. Each failure compounded the mental toll of the entrapment. Hour 10 brought a crisis point. The combination of cold, dehydration, and psychological stress triggered uncontrollable shivering in Mark's body. The involuntary movements caused additional abrasions as his body scraped against the rock. The pain intensified, particularly in his hips and shoulders, where pressure points had developed into deep bruising. The rescuers recognized the signs of advancing hypothermia and worked with renewed urgency, passing additional heat packs and covering what portions of his body they could reach with emergency blankets. Throughout the night, the drilling continued in shifts. The noise reverberated painfully in the confined space, and rock dust filled the air, irritating Mark's eyes and lungs. Yet, each small chunk of removed limestone represented progress toward freedom. By hour 15, enough material had been removed from the critical corner that Mark could pull his knees up slightly, changing his position for the first time in over half a day. This small victory provided renewed determination to endure. At 5:45 a.m. on October 8th, after 18 hours of complete immobility, the final extraction attempt succeeded. As rescuers pulled on the webbing secured around Mark's wrists, he felt his body finally slide forward through the modified S-bend. The sensation of movement after such prolonged stillness sent waves of pain through muscles that had been compressed against stone for hours. Freedom came not with immediate relief, but with a new kind of agony as blood flowed into cramped tissues and damaged skin, pulled against rock one final time. In the small chamber beyond the restriction, rescuers immediately wrapped Mark in emergency blankets and provided warm fluids. Despite 18 hours of torture, the journey out took twice the normal time. When Mark finally emerged into the early morning sunlight, the experience had permanently altered his relationship with confined spaces. What had previously been challenging passages to overcome were now potential traps to be evaluated with newfound respect.